Thank you. Very nice. All right, well, today in the small group dialogue book, we're looking at, I believe it's lesson 6. Yeah, we're looking at lesson 6, the Passover. And, we always like to open with one of those easy questions that everybody can answer. And so the question I'm wanting people to think about a little bit today is that we all have those certain days that we remember, certain days that we celebrate annually. And so I guess my question to you is, what kind of days do you have that you remember? And are those celebrations, are they a positive thing, or can they work against you? So let's just talk a little bit about celebrations and memories.
Phyllis, I have one that nobody else does, and it's unique to our family. There may be other families that do it, but through a strange set of circumstances, we started celebrating March Madness together, the beginning of the college football or college basketball tournament.
Yeah.
And we ended up for almost 20 years getting together with my brother's family and my best friend's family as our kids grew up. Every year for those first days of March Madness, we'd meet at a hotel and do that. And it just shaped all our families because it was such a fun vacation and thing. So we have not been doing it since people moved away and moved overseas and did things, but it's still a marker for everybody's family as the beginning of March Madness. Such fun.
Very cool. How about others? Special days, special memories?
Thanksgiving has always been a favorite of mine since I was a child. You would think that Christmas being so close, but Thanksgiving, it just always snuck up on us because, and then turned out to be so pleasant because all the family was around. And of course, Christmas we looked forward to, and it was always kind of a disappointment. But with Thanksgiving, we never looked forward to it, and it was always a great time.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear somebody say that because Thanksgiving is still my favorite too. Because all I got to do is put a turkey in the oven. I don't have to buy gifts. I don't have to do anything else. I just put a turkey in the oven and open the door, and everybody comes piling in. So I love Thanksgiving more than Christmas. What about others?
Well, for me and my children, it's not a Christian holiday, but Halloween, because 2 of my children's birthdays are so close. My oldest son is the day after. So Halloween became, especially when my kids were younger, just a huge thing in my household. Yeah. And so that always kind of marks off like our holiday season. Like as soon after we know Thanksgiving is coming, then Christmas, the New Year. So Halloween kind of still is like just a bigger than normal deal in my household.
Yeah. One of my daughters is like that too. Halloween is, oh my goodness, huge neighborhood party and chili and ATV rides, and they just make it a big day. And I always say she did that because I hated Halloween. I mean, I hated the making costumes. I mean, one year I put books under their arm and I said, "Go, tell them you're an encyclopedia salesman." I just didn't like to do any of that stuff. So,
my extended family got together when I was a kid on July 4th. Our part of our family owned some property on a river, and so we would always meet down there. And I had these cousins that were my second cousins, but they were really close in age. My first cousins are about 10 years older than me, and my siblings, and so we weren't that close to them. But my other cousins, we didn't live that far away, but it just, it took the responsibility of our mothers to get us together. But they rarely did it. But 4th of July, we were always together, and their mom always brought these wonderful chocolate chip cookies, and we just, I don't remember what anybody else brought, but we had a day together that was just pure fun.
Great.
Yeah.
I always enjoyed Christmas and the Advent time of lighting the candles, and I enjoy doing that with the children, and I enjoy doing that with the grandchildren. So that's my celebration.
Yeah, okay. One of my memories was, I'm not a big Christmas person, but when each of my daughters was born, I wrote a poem for each of them comparing them to a source of light. And so each had their own source of light. And every year on Christmas Eve, we would light candles and I would recite each girl's poem. And that was just such a special time for them. But, now it's so difficult for us to get together. The last few years we have, and that was the first thing the girls said was, do the poems, do the poems. But now this year, again, I doubt that we'll be together again because of, little one moving out of the country. So but those are special times. Well, let's open with today's story. We're doing lesson 6 from the book, and today's story is of the Passover, and so I'll tell that quickly. The Lord said to Moses, I'm going to send one more plague on Egypt, and then Pharaoh will let you leave. In fact, he'll insist that you leave. And so God said, give these instructions to my people. Every family is to find a 1-year-old male lamb without any defects. Slaughter that lamb and then spread its blood above your doors and on your doorpost, and then stay inside. It won't be safe for you to leave your homes. And then roast the lamb and eat it, but wear your coats and your sandals as though you're in a hurry. If the lamb is too large for one family, join with another family and share so that it is all consumed. And the Israelites, and then God said, then at midnight, I'm going to travel through the land of Egypt, and I'm going to kill the firstborn of every family. But when I see the blood upon your doorpost, I will pass over and won't hurt anyone in your family. And the Israelites did exactly as God had commanded. And so that night, God did pass through the land of Egypt. And the firstborn of every family, from the Pharaoh down to the lowest slave, they were all killed. Even the firstborn of cattle and flocks were killed, and there was crying and wailing throughout all of Egypt because no one escaped God's judgment. But he did pass over the homes of the Hebrew when he saw the blood upon the doorposts. Pharaoh then called out for Aaron and Moses to come to him. And when they arrived, he said, go, take your people, take your flocks, and leave. And everyone in Egypt, they also wanted the Hebrews to leave because they were afraid that they would all die. They gave the Hebrews things made of gold and silver. They gave them new clothing. And so that very night, they left Egypt. And after that, every year, the Hebrews, they celebrate Passover in memory of what God had done for them that night. Okay, so today, the dialogue tool that we're working with, and if you have your handouts, we're working on one, it's called the Concept Definition Map. And in the handouts, I sent you one that is completed. And so we're going to take a minute to look at that Concept Definition Map. The one that I've given you that is completed is based on the story of David fighting Goliath, a story that we all know. And you'll see what this tool does, it helps us to think about so many of the concepts that we meet in the Bible. And a concept is an abstract thing. So on this one, on the story of David and Goliath, we're looking at the concept of courage. And we want to take that abstract concept and make it something concrete that we can understand and that we can turn to in our life. So what I had the people do, I had them think of, I told the story of David and Goliath. I had them think for a minute about courage. And I said, I want you, in your groups, you're going to come up with 3 examples of courage. And the examples can come from the story of David and Goliath, or they can come from things that are currently happening in the world, or they can come from common experiences that we all have, but concrete, physical examples of courage. Last week, Mark was asking me about the QAR, which is a question-answer response, and last week we kind of just jumped into the more difficult questions. And I find that when we're doing it with storytelling, we can do that. But with this concept definition map, it's so difficult. And so we do want to do what's called, it's considered a think and search. So we're going to think about courage, and we're going to search through the story and search through our lives and find concrete examples. Whenever you're dealing with something that difficult, you always want to move from the concrete things to the abstract. So if you'll see on your example, the groups that were working with this, they came up with 3 examples of courage. The first one came directly from the story. They said that David fights lions and bears with just a slingshot in his bare hands. He feels responsible for the sheep he is tending and is willing to face danger to protect them. So that's a very good example of courage. The second one, they talked about people who place themselves in harm's way in order to rescue others from dangerous situations. And they talked about firefighters and police and the military. They talked about there are people sometimes who just happen to come upon a difficult situation, and they show great courage to help in that situation. And their third example of courage, they talked about people who are facing a terminal illness or other problems, how those people show courage. And they said that doesn't mean that they don't cry or they don't complain. Crying and complaining is not incompatible with courage, but it does mean that they have an attitude of acceptance and they take on responsibility for their welfare. They don't blame others for their situation, but they place confidence in God's plan. So they came up with 3 very concrete examples of courage. The second step that I wanted them to do then was, after looking at those concrete examples, then I wanted them to move on to step 2 and talk about what are the components of courage. Oh, and I'm sorry, I have that wrong on your handout. I have freedom there. It's supposed to say courage. I'm sorry. So I wanted them to talk about what are the components of courage. And this group said that in order to have courage, there has to be compassion. You have to feel something for other people in order to tap into that courage. They also said there has to be some type of a conflict. If there's no conflict, there's no reason to be courageous. And the third thing that they thought was important was that there's a sense of responsibility. If we have that sense of responsibility, we'll step up to situations that require courage. And then when they finish all of that, I bring them back together and we do our large group discussion on examples of courage and components of courage. And then at the end of the class, I had each person write a personal definition of courage. And I tell them that when they write that definition, that each of their components of courage has to appear in their definition. And this person did a very good job of that. They said, a person demonstrates courage by accepting danger in the face of conflict in order to help others. Courageous people have a sense of responsibility toward others, which makes them want to help, and they have compassion for the human condition. So we're going to do a concept definition map based upon the story that you heard of the Passover. And if you need to go to the text, it's Exodus chapters 11, 12, and 13. So you have a blank page, a blank concept definition map. And the one that we're going to work on the concept of freedom. And so what I want you to do is take a minute on your own to think about some examples of what is freedom. You might have examples from the story that I just told of this 10th plague, or there are examples of freedom in there. You might have examples of freedom from the world today or from things that we all experience. And so I'm just going to give you a minute or two of quiet time to think individually, what are some concrete examples of freedom? And you don't necessarily need to fill out those 3 boxes. You'll do that with your group. But I do want you in the margin to jot down a word or two so that when you come to your group, you know what you want to talk about. Okay, so it looks like you've all had some time to think about it. I think you've all jotted some ideas down. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to have Roger put us into 2 separate groups. So there'll be 3 or 4 people to a group. And in your groups, your job is to talk about your concrete examples of freedom, discuss what you think are examples of freedom, fill out those top 3 boxes. And once you get that done, then you're going to come to step 2, these smaller boxes, and you're going to talk about what are the components of freedom? What has to be there in order for freedom to exist? Well, the 3 boxes on the top, they can all 3 be from the Bible story. I would like at least 1 to be from the Bible story, but any examples that you know of freedom. So if there are things happening in the world right now that deal with freedom, you can put that. If there are just those general things that we all know about freedom, any example that you have. But at least 1 should be from the Bible story. Sometimes they can all 3 come from the Bible story, okay? This is kind of a difficult thing to complete. And if they have a textbook, this form is on page 33 of the small group dialogue book too. So you saw that in the example from David on courage, that one of their things they talked about, that there are people who place themselves in harm's way and they show courage for others. And from that discussion, they said, well, yeah, those people have compassion. And so that's how they came up with their components of courage. So the idea is that whatever dialogue that you have on the examples of freedom should help you to start to figure out what are the components of freedom. Okay? And sometimes, you know, there are 3 boxes. There are some groups say, we only came up with 2 components. That's okay. Others say, oh my gosh, we had 4 components, so we just added 1. It's like, yeah, don't let the form, stop you from anything. Let the form work for you. I know this is a difficult tool to work with, but boy, it always produces such good results. Let's go with 10 minutes and see how that works. And if they need a bit more time, we can do that. And then otherwise, we'll bring them back in. Okay. Well, who wants to start sharing some examples of freedom that we can jot into these boxes?
Well, from today and from the story, it seems like freedom, the movement physically, is first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah, I thought of getting out of prison. That's the same thing.
Yeah, which would also be an actual physical movement. Sometimes that's a good point, Maggie. I've never thought of that. So that would be something we could put in the first box, is sometimes a physical movement. The Hebrews moving out of Egypt, prisoners moving out of prison. Can we add to that?
I can go to the grocery store. I can go to church on Sunday. I can meet with other people. Small group.
Yeah, that's so pertinent to what we're going through right now, because I think with COVID, so many of us feel like our freedoms we're not free to go, we're not free to move. So yeah, that being able to physically move is a sign of freedom. That's great. Thank you.
So 3 days back, we were celebrating a harvest festival in India, the down south in a place called Kerala. We have a harvest festival. So in this, there is everyone in the region do celebrate. There is no religion in it. It's just a festivity of joy and coming together. So we used to generally have a great meal. My wife cook around 30 dishes on that day. That's her commitment. And we all sit together and share it. So that sharing without boundaries, accepting others. So I think that is the freedom. I can talk as I am to them. And that's what I think is
Okay.
freedom.
Yeah, so if I understand what you're saying is that no boundaries, being able to bring together groups of people to celebrate one common thing, that is a sign of freedom. I like that. Can anybody add to that? Or
And we sometimes call it the freedom to assemble,
yeah,
gather.
I think that's a great example. Just that freedom to come together. And again, with COVID, we're seeing that, churches have been shut down. They feel like that's, should be our freedom, that we can come together. And I know when I travel to other countries too, that freedom doesn't necessarily exist. They don't always have that freedom to assemble. They have to be very careful where they meet or what they say or what they do. So yeah, that freedom to come together, to celebrate together, to enjoy each other. That's great. Okay. Do we have a third example of freedom?
I thought of one. I am not a big, women have a kind of a reputation for spending money, and I'm not like that. My older sister is, and my little sister and I are not. And my husband, he knows that. He's seen that, and so I have freedom to buy myself things that I feel I need, or and I don't have to beg or I have the freedom. I don't have to what's the word, justify myself to him, but I have the freedom to spend money when I feel it's legitimate, and my husband trusts me, and so that's freedom. I don't know that all women have.
Freedom to make decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This freedom to make decisions kind of leads me to thinking about freedom from addictions, the freedom to make rational decisions, not burdened by some addiction or sin or problem that is causing me to make bad decisions.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good discussion. Wow. I really like that idea of freedom from addictions, that really helps you to make good decisions. Yeah. And I love that whole idea about that, the freedom to purchase without having to justify, the freedom to make decisions without having to justify. We're coming up on our golden anniversary, and there are some days that I think, I don't have freedom. I have to justify so many things. And I realize that that's not true. But there are days, you do feel that way when you're in one relationship that long. It's like, I have to justify so many things. So, okay, well, I think we've got some really good concrete examples. So, based on that, what are the components of freedom? What things need to be there for freedom to exist? That's where it becomes difficult, because these are abstract thoughts. What has to be there in order for freedom to exist?
Circumstances.
Okay, explain what you mean by that, Maggie.
Well, I'm thinking of track record. I have a good track record too, like Joan, and so I have freedom to make decisions.
When I was thinking about it, I was thinking that there was trust. My husband trusts me.
Okay.
And, so I don't know if that encompasses what you were saying, Maggie.
Yeah, that's a good track record. If he can trust you.
Yeah.
Responsibility would be another word.
Yeah.
Trust. You earn people's trust by behaving responsibly.
Yeah, and do we see those two components, responsibility and trust, do we see that in the story of the Passover?
They had to trust God to leave.
Mm-hmm. Yes, when God says, I'm going to come through and kill the firstborn of every family. Wow, that's huge. That's huge. And so you're right. They had to trust God.
Well, they had to put on their shoes and be ready to leave as instructed.
Mm-hmm. And so I think that shows the responsibility. God gave them very specific instructions, and they had to follow all those instructions. So the responsibility was there that led to their freedom. Good insights. So our components of freedom, we think responsibility, we think trust. Is there a third component of freedom?
Well, back to circumstances, you have to, at first I was thinking, well, you would need transport, a car or a bicycle. And then I thought, well, you'd need legs. And if you didn't have legs, you would need people surrounding you that could carry you, or a wheelchair. So to be able to move, you have to have the circumstances around you have to provide that movement opportunity or ability.
Yeah, that's true. If one of our examples are that moving physically, you have to have the ability to do that.
The number one, it was I used to travel without making any preparation, not carrying much money. I travel in God's providence, and He has a way in providing. So that comes only with deep communication with God. So He will rightly guide me which place to go, where to get some resource, etc., etc. And I love that. And I had traveled around 14 countries the same day without almost nothing. And that's for me is a great way of enjoying the freedom being in the hands of God, number one. During this COVID time, I realized most of the people are holding on to things. They don't want to let go, and they're worried much about the future. But what a great joy if they can let go. This, I'm not going to, life is much beyond that. If I can let this go, that's a great sense of freedom. Actually, I want to pass this message to many of the senior citizens who are worried and having a lot of depression and things like that. I'm putting few things together. The lady who was a sinful lady who was, people drove her towards Jesus with the stone pelting, and he just say, don't sin anymore, and he just simply let without any punishment, nothing, a simple, no harsh anything, just like that. It was a kind of a punishment through freedom, I think. For me, it's just letting you go that touches you, and that is freedom. One another area is Elijah. He asked the king to put, he was challenging other, other gods or anything. So he put on his own altar and he poured water into it rather than keeping it dry for the fire to come. And he kept it filled with water, and he challenged other gods. You keep on praying for the whole day. And then at the right moment, God came and struck, and there was fire. And that confidence is the freedom. I'm so sure about my God will take care of me. And though we can't see any interaction with the God or any confirmation from Him, but there is a freedom within Him that I know what He is thinking. Both of them being in deep communion, so He knows what is there to be. So He was in great communication, great communion. So He has that freedom to take God's word and God's way of doing things, and He literally demonstrate that. Yeah, thank you for listening.
That's great. So that confidence, I think that might relate to when we said trusting in God. I think those two go hand in glove together. That's a great example. And I loved when you said that ability to let go. The woman who had sinned, and God, Jesus told her, go, and sin no more. She was able to let go of that if it was an addiction or a sin or a problem, that ability to let go. So, yeah, I think we've got some great components: responsibility, trust or confidence, the ability to physically move and that ability to let go. And I think all of that comes from, like you were saying, communication. If we can communicate with God, that's how we get those components.
I loved it when he said to be in the hands of God, and whether you're in prison like Paul, has freedom, and he's writing scripture and wonderful things, or if you're out walking among people, there's freedom. So being in the hands of God really is quite broad.
Yeah.
Phyllis, we've been going 16 minutes. Time to...
Okay. Oh, breakout rooms close in 27 seconds. Okay, well then let's just let the breakout rooms close and we'll come back together. So, from the group that I was with, would one of you be willing to share one of our examples of freedom that we talked about?
We talked about freedom to make decisions. That shared about my husband allowing me to spend money, and because he could trust me, and so I have freedom to make decisions that other people don't always have.
Yeah. So that was one of our examples, that freedom to make decisions. What about the other group, the second group? Did you have that as one of your examples? Let's answer that question. Did your group have that, the freedom to make decisions? Did that come in anywhere in one of your discussions?
Ours kind of led more to, I think, centralized around the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, talk about that a little bit.
It was written on paper that there were freedoms given, but then there were still the physical constraints, psychological constraints. We're told that there's freedoms, but there's still kind of constraints surrounding that.
Yeah, the fact that it was written that they were constrained, but the slaves themselves weren't actually free. But at least now they knew that their masters were breaking the law and doing what they were doing. So it started the mental process that no matter what my physical situation is, I know I'm free.
Oh, okay. That would be like Shaji when you were talking about Paul in prison.
Who
Elijah.
Fire in the altar, and he was in command. He even poured water, and he was sure about how God will work. He was in total communion with God, and that was what he was communicating to the people around. And that is the freedom of understanding God, the deeper level of understanding.
Okay, so we're talking about that freedom to make decisions, the freedom to understand God. We're talking about that mental freedom, even though they, with the emancipation, when there were still constraints, but they were beginning to have that mental freedom, knowing that their masters were breaking laws, and so there was a move toward freedom there. Okay, I like that. What else can somebody share that we have not talked about yet, that you talked about in your small groups, examples of freedom?
One of the very first things that I wrote down, freedom to live in a manner I see fit, but adhere to the laws or rules of society or government. So we can attend church, the church of our choice. We get to vote. We can protest. So we're given many different types of freedom, the right to bear arms. The Israelites were granted to leave. And at one moment, the Egyptians were so happy to get rid of them, they're giving them silver and gold and clothing. But then we know that changes. That even though there's a release from authority, there's still not a complete loss of all constraints. There's still those guidelines.
Okay.
Can you imagine a bird inside a cage, a beautiful cage, a bird, a small bird? This is a situation of children at home during this lockdown. They are in a cage but without bars. Number one. Number two is a small story as we are more about talking. There were Arab traders who used to travel across, the desert. So there was an intern with them. So at night time they used to camp somewhere and they tie their camel and they used to rest there. So this intern came running and said, "Master, I forgot, I lost my rope which I tie camel. I'm lost. I don't know what to do with the camel. It may wander around and we may lost the camel." The master said, "Hey, don't worry, you fool." So he went to the camel. He pretended as if he was tying the camel and took the other end and pretended as if he was tying somewhere. And all of them went to sleep, nice sleep. The next day morning, they all set off to the next destination, and they were all, so only one camel was standing there. And this intern came running and said, "Master, this camel is not moving from there. It's just standing there." The master came down and pretended as if he's untying the rope, and the camel started moving. So the rope was not there, but the camel. Same way, we most of the time we are just stuck with certain things, and I just put it as a story, Thank you.
It's a good story. Okay, so we've got some really good examples of freedom. Is there any other example that anybody wanted to share?
Well, we were kind of taken with the idea that the freedom isn't just total. In other words, they left Egypt. They were no longer under the Egyptians, but then they went to Sinai and got rules.
Yeah.
So, now, basically, you're no longer slaves of Egypt, but now you're slaves to the law. This is how you're to act. And Anne said, she's free to go vote, but we pointed out she's free to go vote, but she has to obey the speed limits getting there.
Yeah. And I think one thing we may not have talked about, Maggie brought up in our group about sometimes that you need to be able to move physically for that freedom. And so we talked about the Israelites moving. I think that ties into what John had said, that yes, they left Egypt, they got that freedom, but now they're under the law, so they don't have those freedoms. And we talked about people who have lived in prison, and now when they're released, there's a physical move there. So sometimes that physical move can represent freedom, can be a part of freedom. And yet, like we said, there are still constraints. Okay, anyone else on that, or else we'll start talking about what are the components then? What are the things that have to be there for freedom to exist?
Sometimes you have to have the finances
Oh.
to move, to relocate.
Yes.
And that's what they were given. They were given gold and silver and everything. So part of their freedom is they actually got financed.
I guess that would go with, in our components, we talked about the ability to move. Maggie, you were talking about that. Can you explain that a little bit, what you meant when you said the ability to move?
To move, you'd have to have a means of transport, whether it be a car, a bicycle, or legs, or someone helping you to move. So, yeah, the finances would fit into that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I never even thought about finances. That's one thing I love about these small group dialogues, all the things that come out we don't think about. Okay, what are some other components of freedom?
Maggie was sharing about transport and moving out. I shared in my group about coming together as a freedom. Like I was sharing about a festival where all interreligious, every religion, every community coming together for a meal as a ritual or a festival. So there is freedom to share the story from my community to other community to other religion, and they listen and we share. And it's a way of coming together, freedom.
Mm-hmm. So, and other components of freedom, what needs to be there for freedom to exist?
We talked about the need for responsibility. that can engender trust and promote freedom.
Well, I still think Seiji hit it on the head when he said we have freedom when we're in the hands of God. So whatever our circumstances, if we're in the hands of God, we have freedom, whether it's prison or out and about. I really appreciated that, Seiji.
Yeah, too, that was great.
I like that too.
When we go into prison, they have a program called Free on the Inside.
Uh-huh.
And they take people who feel like they're in bondage. And when they come to Christ and then they start learning the Word, and they often state that they're no longer in bondage. They're free, although they're still in prison.
Yeah.
Well, and the example that Seiji gave was that he could walk around to many countries without a purse or a bag, and God opened the way and provided for each step. So I thought that was a reminder to each of us.
For our components, we're talking about knowing that you're in the hands of God. We talked about trust and confidence, and we saw that definitely in the story of the Passover, that they had trust in God. They had to have that confidence in Him that once they put the blood upon the doorpost, He would pass over them. Responsibility is huge. We talked about in the Passover story how they followed God's instructions. They took that responsibility. And we heard that come up in so many of your, you've got the freedom to vote, but you've got responsibilities on your driving there. There are laws that you have to follow. They had freedom when they left Egypt, but they had responsibilities to the laws. Are there any other components of freedom that I'm seeing one in our group that we talked about? Are there any other that we have not talked about yet that are components of freedom?
Well, we have the ability to let go.
Yeah. Yeah. You want to talk about that a little?
I guess like we were talking about with addictions and different things, to walk in freedom, you have to let go of maybe past behaviors or choices, decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. With the inmates too, that ability to let go. If there's any anger or guilt or doubt, the ability to let go of those things. And that, I think, is an important component of freedom. All right, great dialogue. Anybody have anything more they want to add to this?
I learned a lot. From my group. It was a great time. I'm so grateful for this opportunity. Thank you, Phyllis. You're very helpful. Lots of good insights.
Great. Yeah, I love the small group dialogue, and I just think these simple tools, they really help to pull us together. They help to move us from the concrete examples to the more abstract things of responsibility and ability to let go. The last thing then I would have the small groups to do, and then it's your decision how you want them to do that, but then they need to write their personal definition of freedom. And I always tell them to look at those components, and when they write their personal definition, they are to put as many of those components in there as they can. They should have at least 2 or 3 of the components, because otherwise your definition is empty. Okay, are there any questions on that, or how you would go about doing that? I'm not going to have you actually do that now. I think we can do that after we leave the meeting. You can each write your personal definition of freedom. Okay, so then the last thing, one of the last things that I do when we're in these meetings is I have my groups retell the story. And just the way we did last week, I'll go ahead and start us off. We're going to retell this story of the 10th plague and what happened. And so I'll start us off, I'll tell a little bit, and then somebody else jump in and tell the story. And let's see if, as a group, can we reconstruct the story that I told at the beginning. And so the story goes, the Lord had said to Moses, I'm going to send one more plague, And when I do this one, Pharaoh will let you go. In fact, he is going to insist that you leave. And so then God said, give my people these instructions. Your turn.
Or to get a lamb, one without blemish, and they are to kill the lamb and cook it. I'll just pass it on to the next person.
But they're supposed to take blood from the lamb. I forget if that part comes before or after the cooking and eating it, but and put it on the two doorposts in the lintel of their house.
And God was going to send an angel through the land and over every house, and those houses that did not have the blood on them would lose their firstborn. Their firstborn child would be killed, maybe son killed, and those that had the blood on the doorpost would be passed over and would not suffer that harm.
Down from the Pharaoh to the lowest servant, and there was great weeping and wailing during the night.
Well, we actually left out the eating of the lamb.
Yeah, we did.
And that they won't be safe unless they're in their houses.
Very good, yeah. And what was the instruction about eating the lamb?
They were supposed to eat all of it.
Hold the stuff, wear your slippers, wrap the cloth around your waist, and eat very fast.
Yes, as if you're in a hurry. Okay.
And if you have too much lamb for the family you've got, you're to invite others to join you so you can eat the whole thing.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think we've got that. And then now we're coming to the part that Maggie had brought us to about, you want to repeat that again, Maggie, what you had said?
The firstborn son, I think, was killed from the Pharaoh's house to the lowest servant, including the livestock. And
Right.
during the night, there was great weeping and wailing and screaming.
Mm-hmm.
So Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron, and he said, go, take your people and leave. So, the Egyptians were happy for the people to leave, so they gave them clothing and silver and gold. And they left during the night.
And the closing?
I think they took along the silver and the gold, and also their bread that hadn't had time to rise. I remember that from the story. I don't remember if you put that in.
No, but that's good. Okay. And the very last part of the story?
From that day on, every year they are to celebrate the Passover. Mm-hmm. It is to be a reminder of what God has done for them that night.
Good. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that's an important part of the story. Very good. Okay, well, I think we did a great job with this lesson. And then, if you recall, I would have people go to the back of the book, because we do that overview activity where I have them write a 3 or 4 sentence summary of the story, or they can do the poem. I give them the little 4-line poem, and then they can finish that out. Okay, on this one, the poem says, the angel of death passed over marked homes, but every firstborn in Egypt would die. When they woke in the night and saw this loss, every home in the land did cry. And then I have them write 4 lines that focus just on the Passover. So they can do it as a poem, or they can do it as a short summary. And I tend, when I teach these classes, I tend to make them do that activity before I let them leave. Because that's one of those things that, while it's all fresh in your mind, do it right then and there. And I just think it's so important to do, because I want them, when they get to the end, to have that whole overview written as 12 short summary pieces or 12 short poems. So I always think that's important to have them do that. And then you can take that, and the next week when you meet, have them read that so that you have a review of what you've done. And I find I usually have time to have them read all of their poems or all of their summaries from the very first lesson all the way down to wherever we are now. Because I think that reinforces the story, it reinforces that overview. And that's really where I want them to go. The extra questions in the book, if there was time, they could talk about the connection between freedom and responsibility, or talk about the difference of what's the difference being liberated from something or liberated to something. And then the share the word activity, I actually gave a recipe for lemon almond macaroons, because that's a traditional Passover treat. So, okay, any questions, any comments, any concerns, anything else we need to cover? Otherwise, I think we've done a nice job covering everything.
Thank you. Really nice.
Joan, you have a question?
Yes. So, in your book, there's different ways of leading group discussions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering, the triangle was one, and then this one is a different one. Do you kind of choose which method you're going to use according to the story? I mean, do some stories lend themselves better to other methods, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. Some do lend themselves better. If there's a story, like on this one, I just felt that concept of freedom was important. And so I try to match the tool to the story, to the dialogue. The story, let's see, what did we do last week? The anointing of David. And I just felt that was an easy enough story that we could pull out the three most important lessons. And so on stories that are easier, I'll go to that triangle. On stories that I think the lesson is a little more difficult to get at, I use a more difficult tool like the concept definition. If it's a story that has a lot of strong characters with different motivations, I'll use a tool called Somebody Wanted But So that we can look closely at what does each character in the story want, what conflicts are going to be blocking them, and what's the result of what they do. So, yeah, originally when I started this book, my idea was to show each of these tools and just let people match them to stories. And John very wisely said, yeah, that's not going to work. And so I agree. I think there's a knack to matching the tool to the story. The one thing I think I would have done differently in this book is maybe at the end of the book, I wish I would have listed each of the tools and said, here are stories that this tool would work with. And I still might do that and add that in, because I think there is a knack to matching the tool to the story.
Okay.
Phyllis, that's interesting. And I would be interested in not just the stories that you would choose, but I would be more interested in the list of the techniques and types of stories that they go with. So you just mentioned a couple of them. One, you said there's a story with strong characters, you would use Somebody Wanted But So. Mm-hmm. We've just done a story that has a strong concept in the story, and so the concept definition map is there. But I wondered if you could provide a list of your tools and then the characteristics of the stories, along with maybe some examples of that. I would really value your insight and experience with that.
Yeah, I think that's something I could work on. I think, and like I said, I wish I would have had that in this book, but I just kind of really didn't even think about it at the time I was working with it. So what you want is a list of, here's 7 or 8 different tools. Here are stories that match to those tools. And then you also want, these are the reasons these stories match to those tools?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, so then when I hit a story, I can say, well, now, what kind of story is this most like? And I don't really want just the list of stories, but like what you said, a list of stories or a story that has strong characters, then I would be able to say, yeah, I think this story matches her list and her characteristics. And then I would probably then look at, remember when I asked you, I told you I was going to do the 12 years story,
and which one do you use? And you gave me an example right away. Well, that was something I was wondering about, but that helped. Then I matched that and used that, and it was really helpful.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think that's a good project for me to work on. I like that idea. Okay, I will work on that. I don't know when I'll have that done, but I will work on that. And what I'm going to do, I'll go through John's book of the 260 stories, and I'll look at each one and say, what tool do I think would work, and why do I think it would work?
That'd be awesome.
Okay. Yeah, I can do that.
And then give it to us.
Yeah.
Or something.
Yeah. Yeah, don't hold your breath. I mean, I will work on that, but it's going to take me a little bit to get that.
But while you're working on it, even after you just get a few done, that might be something that we consider. Roger could consider if we want to put that on PT Stories.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think so.
That would be so valuable.
Great.
There's another question I am interested in, and I've kind of been jotting them down as you do it, but I know you're good at keeping a class going. I just jotted down a few things, like when you get to the large group discussion, one of the things I've heard you say is like, well, talk about that a little bit. But then I kind of get wrapped up in what you're doing, and I forget to notice how you're keeping things going. And I would be interested, what are some of the lines that a leader should use intentionally to keep the people engaged in discussion?
Yeah, the two lines I use most is, talk to me about that a little bit more. Can you flesh that out? Can you add to that? The other question I ask people all the time, they'll say something, and then I'll say, what in the story led to that conclusion? What in the story supports what you're saying? So when people were talking about that one of the components of freedom is that sense of responsibility, immediately I asked, I said, did we see that in the story of the Passover? What in the story makes you say that? And that really, those two questions, that really is about the extent of what I ask people, is talk about it a little bit more, and what in the story makes you say that. When I first started teaching, and I would teach literature, and I'd ask a question, and a student would give an answer, and kids, just like us, they'll give a one-word answer, and I would get so excited that, oh my gosh, somebody got it, and then I would just jump in and do all the explanation, and then I thought, wait a minute, that's not right. That's not the Socratic method. So I took a class on the Socratic method, and that's really what they taught us in there. They said, those two questions, talk about it some more. What in the story makes you say that?
That's great.
Okay, then we will see you next week.